Let's be honest, most director's cuts exist for one reason: to sell you the same movie all over again. If fans love a film enough, Hollywood will happily package it up, throw in a couple of extra scenes, slap director's cut or unrated on the cover, and sell it to you one more time. And most of the time those extra scenes don't really change anything. But every once in a while, a director's cut actually makes a movie better. Sometimes it explains characters that never quite made sense before. And sometimes it turns into an entirely different film. Today we're talking about one of those rare cases. By the late 90s, screenwriter Brian Helgeland was quickly becoming one of Hollywood's hottest names. Like plenty of writers before him, he got his start working on a string of forgettable horror movies before moving on to films like Assassins and Conspiracy Theory. Then came L.A. Confidential. Helgeland spent more than 2 years writing the screenplay, and after the film premiered at the 1997 Cannes Film Festival, Hollywood suddenly started treating him like the next big thing. Like many successful screenwriters, Helgeland wanted to direct his own material. He figured the timing couldn't be better, so he picked up the rights to Donald E. Westlake's novel, The Hunter, and started pitching it around town with one important condition. If a studio wanted the script, they had to take him as the director too. Luckily, he didn't have to knock on doors for very long. Hollywood loves to talk about talent, but knowing the right people doesn't exactly hurt either. And Brian already knew one of the biggest stars in the business. He had met Mel Gibson while working on Conspiracy Theory, and the two eventually sat down together at a restaurant in Los Angeles. Gibson loved the script. Even after learning that Helgeland would only sell it as a package deal with himself directing, Mel stayed on board. He had just one condition. Production had to start almost immediately to fit into the 3-month gap he had available at the end of '97. Rushing a movie is usually a terrible idea, but Helgeland really didn't have much of a choice. Say yes and he gets his first directing job with one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. Say no and he probably goes home with nothing but a screenplay and a whole lot of disappointment. Paramount, which worked with Gibson regularly at the time, wasn't exactly thrilled about handing such an expensive movie to a first-time director. Then again, arguing with Mel Gibson wasn't high on anyone's to-do list. So the studio signed Helgeland, and filming was scheduled to begin at the end of September '97. The last major hurdle was casting the female lead. The actresses suggested by the studio weren't who Helgeland wanted, while Maria Bello, his personal choice, kept turning the role down. He didn't manage to convince her until the very last minute. For about 2 weeks, he basically became the world's most polite stalker. He waited outside Bello's apartment, bumped into her outside restaurants, and even tagged along while she was shopping. Eventually, Maria Bello apparently decided that saying yes would be easier than trying to escape him, and she finally agreed to do the movie. The entire film was shot in just 2 months, and according to pretty much everyone involved, production went surprisingly smoothly. In fact, Deborah Kara Unger, whose ribs Gibson accidentally broke while filming one scene, later joked that she'd happily do it all over again, maybe just with a little less enthusiasm next time. The real trouble didn't start until post-production. The test screenings were a disaster. Audiences didn't like the movie, but more importantly, they didn't like Mel Gibson's character, and that's the part that really scared Paramount. The studio started leaning on Gibson, arguing that playing such an unlikable anti-hero could actually hurt his career because audiences simply didn't want to see him that way. Naturally, Mel started worrying too. Going from $20 million per movie to only 15 sounds like a tragedy, and losing $5 million every time you show up to work wasn't exactly something he wanted to experience. So he turned to someone who knew Hollywood better than almost anyone, producer Joel Silver. If Hollywood had a fixer during the 80s and 90s, it was Joel Silver. He had already produced massive hits. He and Gibson had also worked together on the Lethal Weapon movies and Conspiracy Theory, so the two knew each other well. After hearing about the problem, Silver basically said, "Relax, this is fixable." His advice was simple: add more humor, soften the scenes that made audiences uncomfortable, and make Gibson's character easier to root for. Mel took that advice back to Paramount, and that's where this story goes completely off the rails. Exactly who pulled the trigger on Brian Helgeland's departure depends entirely on who you ask. One version says Gibson panicked over the test screenings, became convinced the movie could hurt his career, and personally pushed for both the reshoots and the director's removal. Another version says the studio made the decision, while Gibson simply chose not to fight it and went along with what Paramount wanted. Gibson himself tells a completely different story. According to him, nobody ever fired Helgeland. Gibson says he and the producers simply sat down with the director and suggested making a few relatively minor changes to the movie. Nothing drastic, just a handful of cosmetic adjustments. Helgeland, according to Gibson, refused. He believed this was exactly who his main character was supposed to be, and he wasn't interested in watering that down. Gibson says he understood the decision and respected it. Helgeland remembers things a little differently. All of this happened during the 1998 Academy Awards. That night, he won the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay for L.A. Confidential. Standing there with an Academy Award in his hands, Helgeland figured nobody in Hollywood would dare fire a brand new Oscar winner. Hollywood apparently had other plans. Just 2 days later, he was told he was no longer directing the movie, and that Payback would be reshot without him. Paramount has never really talked publicly about what happened behind the scenes, which makes it almost impossible to know who actually made the final call. After losing the project, Helgeland went to the Directors Guild of America and asked to have his name removed from the credits, replacing it with the famous Hollywood pseudonym Alan Smithee. Which brings us to yet another mystery. One story says the Guild rejected his request. Another claims Helgeland changed his mind after someone pointed out that having your directorial debut released under the name Alan Smithee would be a fantastic way to end your directing career before it had even started. Ironically, Gibson's own version of events seems to support that second story. According to him, after watching the studio's finished cut, Helgeland ultimately decided to leave his name on the film after all. With Helgeland out of the picture, Paramount went to work. Roughly 30% of Payback was reshot from scratch. Every scene where Gibson's character came across as cruel, cold, or just plain unpleasant was either rewritten or thrown out entirely. The scene where he beats Deborah Kara Unger? Gone. Chris Christopherson was brought in. The entire final act was rebuilt. The movie got a happy ending, and jokes started popping up all over the place. The mission was pretty simple: turn Mel Gibson's anti-hero into someone audiences would actually want to cheer for. Helgeland says the only thing he ever heard about the reshoots was how they played at the next round of test screenings. According to people who were there, they actually scored worse than his original version. Needless to say, that absolutely made his day. While Payback was being torn apart, rebuilt, and pushed further down the release schedule, Gibson had enough time to shoot and release Lethal Weapon 4. That film did okay at the box office, but it wasn't quite the blockbuster the earlier movies had been. Meanwhile, Payback sat on the shelf for almost another year before finally opening in February 1999. Honestly, if the reshoots hadn't blown the budget up to around $90 million, Payback probably would have been remembered as a respectable financial success. But once your budget hits $90 million, earning about $160 million worldwide suddenly isn't enough. And instead of a modest hit, the movie ended up being labeled a box office disappointment. And here's where the story gets even stranger. Nobody seems to know who actually directed the finished version of Payback. Gibson says it was production designer John Myhre. There's just one tiny problem with that story. Everyone assumes the person really calling the shots was Mel Gibson himself, and honestly, that wouldn't have been surprising. Just a couple of years earlier, he'd won an Oscar for directing Braveheart. Except there was one obstacle. Directors Guild rules prevented the film's original producer from simply replacing the director and taking over the production. Officially, Gibson couldn't direct the reshoots himself, which is why, according to one popular Hollywood rumor, he did exactly that anyway. The story goes that John Myhre wasn't even on set during the reshoots, and Gibson only mentioned his name because someone had to officially fill the position. But that's not the only version. Another rumor says the person officially sitting in the director's chair was Paul Abascal, who had once worked as Mel Gibson's personal hairstylist. By the late 90s, Abascal had already started directing episodes of shows like Nash Bridges and Tales from the Crypt. Since he and Gibson were close friends, Mel allegedly brought him onto the project almost immediately. And here's the interesting part. Abascal himself later backed up that version of the story. According to him, he was the one directing the reshoots. Myhre's involvement, he claimed, existed only in Gibson's public version of events. So who actually directed the movie? Take your pick. But whichever version you believe, one thing seems pretty obvious. Somebody officially occupied the director's chair while somebody else was almost certainly calling the shots. Helgeland's original version of Payback finally saw the light of day in 2006. Years later, he explained that he'd wanted to finish his version of the film ever since he'd been removed from the project. Finally, in 2005, he decided to call Mel Gibson and ask if he'd support releasing a director's cut. To Helgeland's surprise, Gibson loved the idea. In fact, after hearing the proposal, Mel asked only one question: "What can I do to help?" Once Helgeland explained what he needed, Gibson personally called Paramount and convinced the studio to hand over all of the original footage. On top of that, Gibson's own company, Icon Productions, picked up the tab for the additional costs. One of the first things Helgeland did was replace the score. Chris Boardman's music was out, and Scott Stambler came in instead. According to Helgeland, Boardman's soundtrack simply didn't match the darker tone he'd always intended for the movie. Unfortunately, there aren't any reliable numbers showing how well the director's cut performed on DVD, so it's impossible to say whether it made much money. But financially successful or not, it gave movie fans something incredibly rare: the chance to compare two completely different versions of the same film. And somehow, audiences liked both. The viewer scores for the theatrical cut and the director's cut ended up being almost identical, which means despite all the behind-the-scenes drama, both versions are generally considered pretty good movies. In the end, Payback didn't really destroy anybody's career. Mel Gibson remained one of Hollywood's highest-paid stars for several more years, right up until a series of personal scandals derailed his career in the mid-2000s. Helgeland actually bounced back even faster. In 2001, he landed a $65 million budget to direct another one of his own screenplays, A Knight's Tale. His biggest setback came 2 years later with The Order, starring Heath Ledger. Made for $40 million, it earned only $11 million worldwide. After that, Helgeland focused mostly on screenwriting, contributing to films like Mystic River, Man on Fire, Green Zone, The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, and Robin Hood. Eventually, he returned to directing with 42 in 2013, followed by Legend in 2015. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.